I'd like to begin today I make mention in the book of Colossians. We're not going to turn there, but in the book of Colossians, we read that what the Apostle Paul has to say concerning festivals and new moons and Sabbaths. In other words, he's talking about the sacred times described back in the Old Testament. Leviticus 23, which we read from this morning, and other places in the Old Testament. And he says, don't let anyone judge you. And in context, you look at that context very careful, and it's clear who he's talking about. He's talking about the philosophers who were coming there and teaching the doctrine of asceticism. With all of these man-made rules and regulations, do not touch, do not taste, do not handle. Also along with that, this concept of the worship of angels, whatever that was about, and other things which obviously were very distressing to the Apostle Paul. And he was telling the Colossians, don't let these philosophers judge you in eating and drinking. Are we to assume that they were not eating and drinking? No, they were eating and drinking. They were enjoying eating and drinking in their fellowship. But don't let them judge you in this, or in reference to, or anything pertaining to, or questions regarding a festival or new moon or Sabbath, which some scholars today admit, or they will tell you, say, yeah, what that indicates is that they were actually enjoying participating in these things. They were enjoying observing festivals and Sabbaths and so on, and eating together, probably reference to what is referred to as the love feast and that sort of thing. But they were enjoying these things, and Paul says, don't let anyone judge you in that regard. And he goes on to say, for indeed, some translations, for these are a mere, it should probably read, for these are indeed a shadow of things to come. So the annual festivals and holy days are in fact a shadow of things that are to come. And we look at the holy days, and indeed they are. They are. Every year we look at the annual holy days as they occur, and we see that they are a shadow of the good things that would come, beginning with Passover and then the Feast of Unleavened Bread that immediately follows. Later, the Day of Pentecost, Feast of Trumpets, which we observed recently. And now we come to the Day of Atonement. We have the Feast of Tabernacles coming up, and then the 8th day, or what we call the last great day, accompanying that. So all of these things we understood we understand and have understood for many years that they foreshadow, they were intended from the beginning to foreshadow things that were to come. Now, back in, let's go with that in mind. Let's go back to Exodus chapter. We're going to come up to Exodus chapter 25, but Exodus first of all, in chapter 20, I'm not going to go back there and read it, but in chapter 20, you know what happens there. That's where God appears in the mountain, and the mountain is burning, and all the smoke and the thunder and everything associated with it, and the quaking of the earth, and the children of Israel are very frightened, and God issues His 10 Commandments. This text alone tells us that the 10 Commandments stand apart in the law of God. They are, in fact, the moral law of the law of God, of the so-called law of Moses. This is the moral law. We understand that this is universal. But God, because we see that in the fact that God Himself speaks the law, God Himself writes the law, this law, with His own finger in tablets of stone, and also that these tables of stone are placed inside the Ark of the Covenant, which is kept in the inner sanctuary of the most holy place. The inner sanctuary is the most holy place, and this is where God would meet with man. This is the inner sanctuary represented the throne of God, or the dwelling place of God. That was in the tabernacle. And so the 10 Commandments were kept in the Ark of the Covenant in that location. So we have all of that. So we have the 10 Commandments that are given, and then you see right away toward the end of the chapter there, chapter 20, that God begins to talk to them about altars, the kind of altar He wants His sacrifices to be brought to Him on. This tells us something immediately. It tells us that nothing has changed as far as how to approach God from older times. How did all the patriarchs come before God? They always came with sacrifices, didn't they? You see it over and over again. They'd build an altar to God. They'd offer a sacrifice. It goes back to Cain and Abel. They came before God with sacrifices. And of course, Cain he had some kind of defect with his sacrifice. And Abel's sacrifice was received, accepted by the Lord. So we see that sacrifice is still going to be used as the means whereby we come to God. Now that's important to understand that, because nothing has changed. Nothing has changed. When the new covenant has come, now that it has come, nothing has changed. Sacrifice is still required to come before God. And we'll get into that a little bit later. In fact, we were singing about it today. We're singing about it. And then he goes on to talk about various other laws in chapter 21, 22, and 23. We see in these chapters ordinances concerning civil and penal laws, laws concerning worship, case laws, also known as statutes. These statutes and ordinances we see listed here through these chapters, and various regulatory laws for the life that Israel would live in the Promised Land. So all of these things are there. And then we come to chapter 24, and we see here that the covenant, based on all of these laws, beginning with the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, the covenant is offered, it is confirmed here. I'll just read a portion of this, chapter 24, verse 3. Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the rules, apparently meaning everything that you read about in the summary statement from chapter 20 through chapter 23. He read all of this aloud before the people, and all the people answered with one voice and said, "All the words of the Lord has spoken, that the Lord has spoken, we will do." And Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. He rose early in the morning and built an altar in the foot of the mountain and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. And he sent young men of the people of Israel who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen to the Lord. And Moses took half of the blood and put it in the basins, and half the blood he threw against the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant. This evidently refers to what we just read from what we see from chapters 20 through 23 there, the summation of the covenant law. He read in the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people, and they said, "All that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient." And Moses took the blood and threw it on the people and said, "Behold, the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words." So he makes this covenant. Skipping over to verse 17, it says, "Now the appearance of the glory of the Lord was like a devouring fire on the top of the mountain." This is when Moses went back up into the mountain. He went up into the mountain, and the people could see this glowing in the top of the mountain. And it says it was as a devouring fire on the top of the mountain in the sight of the people of Israel. Now this is, you compare this with what happened earlier when they first encountered God at Mount Sinai. It is consistent with it. It tells us that God is a consuming fire. It was designed to instill fear and thereby respect in the people of Israel, because after all, God was dealing with the people of a hard heart, wasn't he? So this instilled fear, and they had entered into covenant relationship with him. They had just said, and this was signed with blood, they had just said, "We will do all that the Lord our God has commanded us to do on this day." And so now God reminds them what they're dealing with. Our God is a consuming fire. Now, then right away, interestingly enough, right away you find instructions concerning contributions for the building of a sanctuary. Now what's that all about? Having decided now, having seen now that God is a consuming fire, yet we read this. Let's read a little further here. I'm not going to read the whole thing here, but he calls for this collection of this contributions from the people, from precious metals and fine materials and things that they're going to use to construct the tabernacle and the furnishings of the tabernacle and the garments of the priesthood and so on. And this is very expensive stuff here. As you read through it and understand if you understand in ancient times what you're reading about here, this is very expensive items. And then he says, "And let them make me a sanctuary," verse 8, that I may dwell in their midst. You get that? Here, this God who is a consuming fire. Here, the God that when they approach the mountain, God says, stand back, nobody touch the mountain, not even a beast, stay away. Anyone who touches the mountain, he will die. And so they stayed away, and they trembled as God gave the 10 Commandments, and as they saw all the display that went on there. And now then they're reminded once again when Moses goes up into the mountain to encounter God, they see the glowing light, and they see that he had the appearance of a devouring fire. So on the one hand, we're told that God is a devouring fire. You'd better stay back. On the other hand, we're told that now I'm going to construct, here's the instructions for you, I'm going to have you construct a place for me to dwell among you. And when you start looking at how the construction was to take place, it was very clear that yes, God is a consuming fire. That's why it is constructed in such a way as to keep the people away from Him at a certain distance. You know, that the tabernacle we'll read a little bit of that as we get to it. But it was surrounded by a tent-like wall called the courtyard. And this was where the people could enter into that with their sacrifices, but nobody was to go into the most holy place where the Ark of the Covenant was, where God would meet with men, particularly the high priest, except for the high priest himself, and then once a year. And which day was that? Today, the Day of Atonement. That's the only time anyone could go into the most holy place and actually would meet with God there and present the blood of these sacrificial animals. So on the one hand, you have God as the consuming fire who lets people know, that's what the tabernacle stood for, and the courtyard surrounding it. And it was quite a structure, quite a beautiful structure really, and made of all these expensive things. Anyone seeing it in that day wouldn't say, well, look at that old tent standing out there. No, it was quite elaborate and quite beautiful. And so the people could come to a certain distance. They could actually go inside into the courtyard. That's where they were most near, the holy place where God dwelt. But they couldn't go into the holy place itself because you had two things going on here. One thing, our God is a consuming fire. Stay back. And why did people have to stay back? Because of their sins. Because they were sinful people. And sinful people cannot approach a holy God. On the other hand, God is saying, but I have provided a means whereby you can approach me. You have to do so with precautions, though. And you have to do so through a mediator. And that mediator was the high priest. And so you can read the whole thing for yourself sometime. You've probably done it in the past, but you read about the Ark of the Covenant, about the table of showbread, the golden lampstand, the tabernacle itself and the dimensions of the tabernacle, the bronze altar, the cord of the tabernacle, the priestly garments, all the other furnishings of the tabernacle, everything in these several chapters here. I want to just call your attention to the fact that as you read through this, it's usually, in most translations, it's in terms of cubits. It's to be so many cubits long, so many cubits wide. Well, the tabernacle itself was 45 feet. If we translated something we can kind of get our minds around. 45 feet long, 15 feet wide, and 15 feet high. So a pretty nice little structure there. And it was composed of two compartments. The first compartment was called the holy place. And this is where you find the altar of incense, the table of showbread, and the golden lampstands, or the golden lampstand. And also the second compartment, they were separated by a curtain. The second compartment is what is called the most holy place. And this is where you find the Ark of the Covenant. And this is the place the high priest would go to every year on the Day of Atonement and meet with God on behalf of the people. Understand this, the high priest represented the people. Everyone couldn't just come waltzing in there, but he could. But when he met the required conditions, he could come in there on behalf of the people. And then on the outside, the courtyard, the the hangings that formed the courtyard was 150 feet long. It was rectangular, 75 feet wide. So that was quite a structure out there, and the people could come in at the east entrance, or that was the entrance, and in the courtyard on the eastern end, that's where you find the altar of burnt offerings. That's where people brought their sacrifices. And then you also find the bronze basin there where all the ceremonial washings were done. Now, when the people would come with their sacrifices, they would bring their sacrifices. Of course, the priesthood was involved in that. They'd bring their sacrifices, would be altered at the altar of burnt offerings, and they would bring their petitions and sacrifices in acts of worship before God. And then the priest would go into the first part of the tabernacle, the holy place, not the most holy place, with the petitions of the people. Now you see that being played out in the book of Revelation. And it's symbolically, of course. You see that being played out in the heavenly tabernacle. And in fact, we're told and we understand very clearly that all of this that we read here in the book of Exodus, the structure of the tabernacle and all of its furnishings and the priesthood and all the rituals associated with it, that all of this symbolized the heavenly temple of God and, of course, foreshadowed the priestly work of Jesus Christ himself. I'll just refer you to Leviticus 16. We're not going to turn there and explore that today, but that's where you find the entire atonement ceremony described. The high priest would do these various offerings. He would offer, first of all, a sin offering for himself and for his house, apparently meaning the priesthood in general, and go into the holy place with that and present the blood before the Lord. And then now that prepared him, it set him apart or sanctified him for the purpose of making atonement for the people. Now he could go in with the blood of the sin offering, and he could go in representing and on behalf of the people and present that for the people. Then he would come out, and at some point in time, of course, it has a description of all the washings and the changing of garments and so on that went on during that time. But he would come out, he would eventually lay hands on the second goat. There were two goats presented, and but the one was offered as a sacrifice. The second goat, then he would lay hands on it, confess all the sins and abominations and faults of Israel, and then he would have a fit man lead the goat away into the wilderness. This is powerful symbolism for the people because they were seeing God do exactly what God said he would do if they were obedient to the covenant. And if they would come to him with a pure heart, a repentant heart. And that's what the fasting, by the way, is all about. And that is, he would remove their sins as far as east is from west. And so the high priest would send those sins away into the wilderness. And this is powerful symbolism for those who saw it. Now, we understand what all that means, of course. We see how it plays out in the New Testament. We see what the book of Hebrews says about it. We'll take a look at some of that a little bit later. But I wanted to mention also that all of the annual holy days are this way. When you look at, for example, as I mentioned earlier, we recognize that they do display Christological things. But I was going to mention that traditionally, and nothing wrong with this, traditionally we speak of the unfolding plan of God, and we align the holy days with specific events to take place along the way. For example, Christ, our Passover, is sacrificed for us. That aligns with the Passover. Then you see the Holy Spirit coming on the day of Pentecost. And then what's the next thing to happen? The second coming of Christ. We relate that to the Feast of Trumpets. And you've heard many sermons, no doubt, over the years. And you see other things. You see, as you read through Revelation, you see the second coming of Christ. You see the binding of Satan. You see the millennial reign, the white throne judgment, followed by the new heaven and new earth. And all of these have been aligned with the various festivals and holy days. And all that's well and good. I'm not here to say, oh, no, that's all wrong. But I am here to say that every one of those holy days also picture Christ himself. Christ himself. And they present for us a good opportunity just to focus on the person of Christ, because He has various offices. He will accomplish various things during this unfolding of God's plan. And I gave a sermon on that. I think it might have been in Tyler. I don't know. It could have been here. It could have been in Tyler. It was longer than 15 minutes ago. I'm not sure about it anymore. But in Tyler, on Christ in the holy days. And in that message, I pointed out, well, it's obvious Christ, our Passover, is sacrificed for us. He is that substitutionary sacrifice for the firstborn, or the Passover in Egypt was sacrificed instead of the firstborn dying in the plague that befell Egypt. So He is in that sense a substitutionary sacrifice. That's why the Apostle Paul says Christ, our Passover, has been sacrificed for us. And the Feast of Unleavened Bread follows. We could see that as representing Christ as the bread of life. Then the day of Pentecost, when the Holy Spirit came and filled the disciples, and they began this work that Christ had prepared them to do. We can understand that as representing Christ as life-giving Spirit, as the Apostle Paul uses that expression to describe Him. Christ in His work as life-giving Spirit, or Christ as distributor of the Spirit, because He says that He would pray the Father, and He and the Father would be involved in giving the Holy Spirit. So Christ is the distributor of the Spirit, or is Himself the life-giving Spirit. And then also in the Feast of Trumpets, we can understand that as portraying Christ as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And then today, of course, we understand that the Day of Atonement, that pictures Christ in His role as High Priest. And we had that, it was in a song service. Practically every song was related to that in one way or the other. And then the Feast of Tabernacles, Christ as Word incarnate. He pitched His tent and dwelt among us. Christ as Word incarnate. The 8th day, or last great day as we are accustomed to calling it, Christ as firstborn of the new creation. So you can see Christ foreshadowed in all the festivals and the holy days. And what I want to do today is focus on the Day of Atonement, since this is the Day of Atonement. I'd like to go over to Hebrews chapter 8, Hebrews the 8th chapter. Before that chapter begins with verse 1 there, we're going to, no need to read any of it, but I'll just mention in summary that the writer labors to show how Christ's priesthood is vastly superior to the Aaronic priesthood. That is to say, the priesthood of the Old Testament we were just talking about, which involved all of those sacrifices, which involved the high priest going into the holy place on the Day of Atonement, and the structure of the tabernacle, all of it, what we call the ritual law or the ceremonial law that's described back there in the book of Exodus, also in Leviticus and other places in the Old Testament. So the writer of the book of Hebrews is laboring here in chapter 7 and in previous chapters to show how Christ's priesthood is vastly superior to the priesthood of Aaron. And then he shows how the former served as a copy and a shadow of the latter. And so we'll begin in chapter 8 and verse 1. This is what the New Testament tells us about the meaning of the priesthood, the Old Testament priesthood, how it foreshadows the new, and also it instructs us on what the Day of Atonement was really all about. It says, now the point of this in what we are saying is this: we have such a high priest, one who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, a minister in the holy places, in the true tent that the Lord set up, not man. For every high priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices. Thus it is necessary for this priest also to have something to offer. Speaking of Jesus Christ. Now, if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there are priests who offer gifts according to the law. They serve a copy and shadow of the heavenly things. For when Moses was about to erect the tent, or the tabernacle in the wilderness, he was instructed by God, saying that, see that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown you on the mountain. And the implication here is that the pattern shown you is based on something that exists. It exists in another realm, though. It is the heavenly sanctuary. But as it is, Christ has obtained a ministry that is as much more excellent then the old as the covenant he mediates is better since it is enacted on better promises. For if that first covenant had been faultless, there would not have been occasion to look for a second, for he finds fault with them when he says, and then he quotes from Jeremiah 31 about the establishment of the new covenant. Now, you might think as you read through this, and I've thought this myself at times past, I say, okay, he's talking about the priesthood and showing how Christ's priesthood is superior, and that the Old Testament priesthood was but a type and shadow pointing to the true priesthood, the heavenly priesthood, which is that of Christ. And now then he seems to be switching subjects just based on the concept of newness, new covenant. Okay, so is he really switching switching subjects here? And the answer to that is no, he's not. Actually, this is very consistent, because you think about it, the original covenant, by that I mean the Sinai covenant, was conditional. It was absolutely conditional. You see the terms spelled out for us in very clear terms. Obey me, as you have agreed to do. Obey me and keep my commandments, my statutes, my judgment. Keep my charge. Be faithful to the covenant. And what would happen? Well, you will live. It's talking about the nation of Israel. You will live. You will prosper in your land. You will have abundance in your land. You will have deliverance from all of your enemies. And you will become that great model nation that God intended it to be in the beginning. So this was the promise of blessings for obedience to the covenant. But on the other hand, he says, if you do not obey, however, if you don't obey, if you disobey, if you turn to idolatry, if you turn to the ways of the nations and abandon worship of the Lord your God, then this is the result. You'll die. I'll scatter you among the nations. You've read the curses and so on, but this is exactly what happened. It says he finds fault with them when he says this. So the point is this. Aaron would go, or the high priest would go into the most holy place every year to offer the sin offering for the sins of the people. And they're gathered outside. They're round about the tabernacle, in their dwellings perhaps, and some of them no doubt gathered at the tabernacle itself. They're fasting, which represents the repentance and the mourning for their sins. And here Aaron is, or the high priest, whoever he might have been at the time, goes into the most holy place, into the presence of God, and presents the blood of the sacrifice, and then goes out and then lays his hands on the live goat and professes all the sins of Israel and sends it away. Okay? So we're talking about the terms of the covenant here. You must have this purity in order to be inconsistent, or be consistently and ongoingly in a relationship with God, in covenant relationship with God. That's the way it was. So in order to be in covenant relationship, they had to be obedient to the covenant, which means that because they were a sinful people, the high priest had to keep going back year after year after year to offer the sin offering on behalf of the people, so that this atonement could be made, this reconciliation could occur, and the covenant could continue. But at a certain point in time, God says enough. Enough is enough. When they turned to idolatry, they turned away from God, and God gave them every chance, every opportunity to turn around and repent and return to Him, and they didn't. Then eventually, guess what happened? Well, let's read it in verse 13. Verse 13, it says, in speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete. That's what happened. The first one became obsolete, not because it was a bad covenant, it was a good one. God Himself is the author of it, a very good one. But Israel, it says, having found fault with them because of their disobedience, then it became obsolete. You can't have a standing, very good covenant, ongoing, and in effect, if you have the people being unfaithful to it. Doesn't work. So they were unfaithful, and so the first one was made obsolete, and it was their fault. And what is becoming obsolete, this means anything that is becoming obsolete, he's making the point here, anything that is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. He's not saying, well, the old covenant is still ongoing, it's slowly vanishing. No, the point is anything. Let me illustrate it with something modern. How many of you remember going into offices and you hear the typewriters going? Do we have anybody that made the mistake of deciding to become a typewriter repairman? I'm sure glad I didn't make a decision in that direction, because I remember very well when I started with the newspaper business, we used typewriters, regular old typewriters. The good ones, the electric ones, where you don't have to hit reach up there and slap it and make it for a new line, but you just hit that button, that thing does it automatically, and it's so easy to type on. Rather than mash the mechanical type of typewriter. But I remember very well using those. I took typing when I was in high school, and usually I got one of the mechanical ones. That's where I learned on. We had one of those at home, and I could use it there. And we did have a few of those new electric ones there in the classroom. And if you're lucky enough to get there in time to get one of those, that's all the better. But usually I wound up with one of the mechanical ones, which is a good thing to learn on. When I got into the newspaper business, though, we were still using typewriters. And I would bring articles and whatnot to the secretary. She would type them in regular typing paper, actually the legal size typing paper. And then I would edit and find errors. And what she would do was either retype it or would mark it with a black magic marker, and underneath in brackets put the correction. And then I would take this stack of papers to the place that would print the copy I was going to use to paste up in the paper, and they would run it through a scanner, and it would come out this nice, neat little column. And I'd take that one column as designated width, and we would actually by hand would lay that out, paste it up, and create each page of the newspaper. So that's the way we used to do it back then. But I remember those typewriters. Now I remember very well when we converted. Now other people already had computers. I'd heard about it, but I figure we were, that's not for us yet. Well, here comes the boss one day with a computer, an old Commodore 64 of all things, and he puts it up in the office there, and we're going to start using that. And then we will send it electronically directly to the place that did the printing of the copy. Actually, it was film. It was on film, but it's like really fine paper, really good paper, good quality paper. And the film we would use to paste up. So we'd send it that way. And I thought, oh no, we have a perfectly good system here. And now I'm going to have to learn how to use a computer. And I thought it was going to be very hard, but just within a few days after we started, it was so easy to use it and so easy to send things, even though I still had a dial-up phone back then. I have to hook that thing up and dial it up and send it that way across the wires. I thought, man, that's amazing. It goes down there without me having to take it with a stack of papers. But anyway, the old typewriters, as great as they were, became obsolete, didn't they? Because we were kind of on the tail end of that. Other people already using computers, and there we were still using typewriters. So anything that is becoming obsolete is ready to vanish away. Go into any newspaper office today and see how many typewriters you will find. See if it sounds the same way as it did back in the old days. When you go into a newsroom, you hear all the typing going on, and the ding, and all of that, everything constantly going on. Like, no, everybody's on computers, and you lay out the pages and everything on the computer screen right there. It's very, very different, and a lot easier. But anyway, that just illustrates the point. Anything that is obsolete or becoming obsolete is growing old, and it's ready to vanish away. And that's what he's saying about the Sinai covenant. And why? Because of the sins of the people. And then from there he goes on to describe the new covenant, not only the new covenant, but also the high priesthood of the new covenant. And that's what this day points to. Let's continue the account, but let's skip down to verse 11 of chapter 9. Chapter 9, verse 11, "But when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things that have come, then through the greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation, he entered once for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood." So what does this tell us? He's not only high priest, he's also the offering. He's both priest and sacrifice. So he goes in with his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption. "For if the sprinkling of defiled persons with the blood of goats and bulls and with the ashes of a heifer sanctifies for the purification of the flesh." Now what does that mean? Well, what he's talking about here is what we might call ceremonial purity. It sanctifies for the purity of the flesh, or purification of the flesh. And what this means, it prepared the worshiper, or it prepared him and made him ritually clean so that he could now approach the holy place in worship. And he calls it here purification of the flesh. That's what these sacrifices did. If you had violated some rule, you're ritually impure or unclean. Let's say you'd touched the body of touched a dead body, or you'd handled something unclean, or many other things that you might have done. Some things, not morally wrong, but you were now ceremonially unclean. You could not approach the holy place until you first were cleansed. That means you were sanctified. To be purified is to be sanctified, to re-sanctify yourself, re-prepare yourself, so now you can go before the holy place. Now what is that for? You think that doesn't make a lot of sense, really, but it does. It really does, because it prepares the people mentally to understand, look, our God is a consuming fire. You don't go before Him just any old way. You don't go waltzing in there, in jeans and barefoot and T-shirt. I'm figuratively speaking, of course. You got to dress up, and I'm not saying people have to dress up to come to church. Now, I'm just using that as a figure of speech. There's a particular way you must approach God, and this instills in the minds of the people that He cannot be approached just any old way, that He is special. He's special. He's not one of the gods of the heathen. He is the Creator God, the true God. And when you approach Him in this condition of sanctity which He defines. And so that's what the people would do. Well, continuing on, he says, if that was for the purification of the flesh, in other words, you do those things in order to prepare yourself to properly worship God at the tabernacle, how much more, he says, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered Himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works? Dead works is not talking about works of the law, as some people seem to think. It's talking about sinful works. Sinful works, the things that cause the need for the atonement to begin with. How much more will it purify our conscience? And this is not only an external thing, as in the ceremonial purity rules. This is internal. It purifies the conscience, because there's now no longer any need to carry thoughts of those sins, because they have been dealt with once for all. So it purifies the conscience from dead works, from those sins that are past, to serve the living God. This is far more than mere ceremonial purity. Therefore, He is mediator of a new covenant, so that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance. Let's move on from there to verse 22 to continue the account. It says, "Indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins." You go back and read the law of the sin offering, and I think it's Leviticus 4, is it? Read about the law of the sin offering, and when the ruler, a particular leader, sins, he describes the type of sin offering he is to bring. It says, and when he offers it, it's offered properly, of course, then God will forgive him. And then if a group of people sins, and no, the kind of sin is also designated here. You can't murder somebody and say, well, I better get down there with a sin offering to get forgiveness. Can't do that. No, these are sins committed in ignorance. In other words, you just didn't know about it. You don't say, oh, I didn't know I wasn't supposed to kill my neighbor. You don't do that. Everybody knows that that's wrong. Everybody then knew that it was a sin, a great sin, and it called for the death sentence. But these are sins committed in ignorance, things that you might not know about. It could be other ritual purity laws, but things committed in ignorance. And in order to have those things cleared from the record, as it were, then you had to offer the sin offering. So again, this is restricted. It's limited on what it could do. It says, and God will forgive it. In other words, He will restore that sinner, that person, to a relationship where he can now continue worship of Him properly at the sanctuary. So, continuing on here, it says, thus, in verse 23, thus it was necessary for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these rites, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. Now wait a minute, what's he saying here? When you go back and read what the high priest did on the Day of Atonement, it said that he would go into the most holy place and he would make atonement for the holy place. What does that mean? See, this is what he's referring to here when he says it was necessary. Let me read it again. It was necessary for the copies of the heavenly things, that's the earthly sanctuary, to be purified with these rites. Okay, that was for purification of the holy place itself. But the heavenly things, the heavenly things themselves, with better sacrifices than these. So the question that comes to my mind, if the holy place, you can kind of understand why that needed to be purified, because it was in the midst of a sinful people. But why would the heavenly sanctuary need to be purified? I've heard some pretty wild theories on this. For example, I've heard that, well, you read over in Revelation about the devil cast down. He was up there. The devil was up there. With all that sin and evil, he getting, all these evil smudges all over the place in the heavenly tabernacle, I suppose, had to be cleaned up. Has to be purified. Now, that was pretty wild there. That's not what he's talking about. See, when it says purified, what he's talking about is sanctified. What it means is set apart. And the earthly sanctuary itself had to be set apart by the blood of these animals, the sin offerings that the high priest brought in there, had to be set apart in order to be the place where the Israelites could meet with God. But they met with Him, of course, in the person of Aaron. He was their representative. So he can go in there now representing them. And so he brings their petitions to God as one of them. Do you understand? That's what it means. It doesn't mean that the sanctuary is full of sins and little smudges of sin all over the place, had to be cleaned up with blood or anything like that. It just means that it was sanctified. It was set apart for that use. Now the people can come, as it were, but in the person of Aaron, their representative. And what he's saying is the heavenly sanctuary must be purified as well, but also with blood. But not the blood of animals, the blood of Christ. And that means not purified in the sense that we think of purified, but sanctified. In other words, it has now been set apart for an appropriate place where we meet with God, where sinful human beings meet with God. And we do so through the person, through the agency of our high priest, Jesus Christ, who was here as one of us. And now He's in the very presence of God. And not only that, there's a difference too. The high priest in the ancient times would come out of the tabernacle, of course send the second goat away, and then every year he'd go back in there, and then back in there the next year, again and again. What did the high priest do? Our high priest, our representative, who opened the way to the most holy place for us, what did he do? He sat down. at the right hand of God the Father himself. So he's not just before the mercy seat. That's his throne too. He sat down at the right hand of the power on high, the Father Almighty himself. And so his sacrifice, his offering, and what he does for us in opening the way to the most holy place and therefore reconciliation with God is permanent. Doesn't have to go back and repeat it year after year after year. So that's what we're reading about here. The heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these, for Christ has entered not into holy places made with hands, which are copies of the things, of true things, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. Nor was it to offer himself repeatedly, as the high priest enters the holy place every year with the blood not his own, for then he would have to suffer repeatedly since the foundation of the world. If that's the way it worked, no, one time. But as it is, he has appeared once for all at the end of the ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. And just as it is appointed for man to die once, and after that comes judgment, so Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to deal with sin. In other words, not to do what he did the first time. He's not coming back to repeat the same process as the high priest had to do. He said, but to save those who are eagerly waiting for him. In other words, those who have come before the throne of grace through the blood of Christ, the once-for-all sacrifice, are the ones waiting for him. And when he comes again, he's coming to receive them and save them to the uttermost. It's a beautiful, beautiful message. Of course, it's what we've taught all along. But when we look at it in this light, in the light of what we see in the Old Testament types and shadows, and how those types and shadows are fulfilled in the person of Christ, we see this rich fullness of it all. Now let's skip a lot of this, skip on over to chapter 10 and verse 19. There's some exhortation for us in all of this. And we'll close with this. Some exhortation for us. Those of us who have been redeemed by the blood of Christ. Those of us who recognize our high priest, who put our trust, our faith, our total confidence in the work of our high priest, what he has done, what he has accomplished in opening the most holy place to us, now that we can come before God with a pure conscience because we know he has reconciled himself with us through the blood of Christ. Then there's some admonition that goes along with that. Verse 19. Therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the holy place by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way that he opened for us through the curtain, that is, through his flesh, it's referring to his crucifixion, the tearing of his flesh, just as the temple curtain was torn at a certain point in time. And since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart of full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. Perhaps it could be metaphorical or it could be reference to baptism. Anyway, verse 23, let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering. Here's the admonition, the exhortation. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. I don't know about you, but as I look at the world today and the condition of this world, I can't tell you about prophetic times. It's not my place to do so. Some things haven't been revealed. We'll just have to wait and see. But from all the appearance of things, I think I can say it looks like that day is drawing near. At the very least, we know that life is limited. Even at best, it is limited. And for each one of us, in a sense, that day is drawing near. So the exhortation for us at the end of all of this, realizing that we do have such a great high priest, realizing that his blood was shed for our redemption, that we might be reconciled with God, that we may approach the most holy place and now come into this fellowship and union with God in such a profound way, far greater than at any other time previous to that. Now that we have all of this, then the admonition, the exhortation is, well, let's hold fast to that and let's encourage one another. Let's don't fail to meet together and come together to encourage each other to remain faithful, remain strong through thick and thin until that day when all of this that we're talking about here and have been talking about for years comes to fruition. When Christ returns, not to deal with sin again, all over again, as He did once and for all, but this time to reward those who are faithful to Him and who have come before God through His blood, looking to Him as high priest and the founder of a new covenant which saves us to the uttermost. So keep that in mind as we, for the remainder of the day, for this Day of Atonement, and in the days ahead, and every Day of Atonement, because that really is the very heart of what it's all about. That is central to the very gospel message itself. And this Day of Atonement pictures the gospel of Jesus Christ.